Welcome to Cassandra Revenge Stories, where quiet women turn betrayal into reckoning.
My name is Catherine Mathis. I'm 30 years old. On a Tuesday morning in October, I sat in a fluorescent-lit hearing room in Salem, Oregon, across from my own father, and I pressed play on a voicemail that ended my family. The recording lasted 11 seconds. The room held 40 people. Not one of them breathed. But before I tell you what that voicemail said, before I tell you what my father did with my dead husband's name and my license, and $412,000 that never belonged to him, I need to take you back to the moment I first realized the ground beneath me wasn't solid. Because I thought I knew who my father was. I thought I knew what family meant. I was wrong about both. And the proof was sitting in a P.O. box I didn't know existed, addressed to a version of me that my father invented. Welcome back to this channel, where we tell stories about the people who discovered the truth and refused to bury it again. If you believe that loyalty should never be a weapon used against the person giving it, you're in the right place. Before I continue, if this story speaks to you, take a second to hit subscribe and drop a comment below. I want to hear from you, especially if you've lived something like what I'm about to describe. Now, to understand how I ended up in that hearing room with a file thick enough to break a table, you have to go back 3 years to a version of me that barely recognized her own reflection in the mirror. I was 27 when Eli died. Sudden cardiac event. That's what the death certificate said. 4 words for a man who could name every constellation visible from our back porch in Southeast Portland, who sang off-key to Nora while he changed her diapers, who built his private therapy practice from a single rented office into something that helped 200 people a year. Sudden cardiac event. He was 31. Nora was 2. I found him on the kitchen floor at 6:15 in the morning with his coffee mug still warm on the counter. The mug had a chip on the rim that he always drank from anyway, because Nora had knocked it off the table learning to walk, and he said that made it hers. I kept that mug. I still have it. But that morning, I didn't pick it up. I dropped to my knees and I pressed my hands against his chest, and I screamed his name until the paramedics pulled me away. And then I stood in our kitchen holding our daughter while a stranger in a uniform told me my husband was gone. The weeks after are fog. Not the poetic kind. The kind where you forget to eat, where you put Nora's bottle in the microwave and stand there for 4 minutes before remembering you need to press start. The kind where the shower runs cold because you've been sitting on the tile floor staring at the drain. I was a licensed marriage and family therapist. I understood grief clinically. I could name the stages, identify the cognitive distortions, recommend the interventions. None of that knowledge could reach me. It floated above my head like a language I used to speak. Eli's practice needed to be wound down. His clients needed referrals. His billing needed to be closed out. His lease needed to be terminated. Insurance claims in progress needed to be finalized. I couldn't do it. I could barely dress myself in the morning. I was seeing my own clients, rebuilding my caseload after taking maternity leave that had extended into the chaos of early parenthood, and I was doing it alone now, on a single income, with a toddler who kept walking to the front door and saying "Dada" in a voice that could crack stone. My father offered to help. Gene Mathis, 62 years old, certified public accountant for 35 years. He'd done the books for Eli's practice as a favor when Eli first opened the doors, and he'd kept doing them because Eli trusted him and because my father liked being useful. When Dad said he'd handle closing everything out, the billing, the insurance, the financials, I felt the first moment of relief I'd experienced since the kitchen floor. He's my dad, I thought. He's a CPA. He managed money for a living. This is what fathers do. They carry what their children can't. I signed what he put in front of me. I want you to understand that. He'd bring paperwork to the house, always when I was feeding Nora or running late for a session or standing in the kitchen with that look he'd later describe to my brother as useful. He'd say, "Just your signature here, Katie Bird, standard stuff, closing out the last quarter. And I'd sign my maiden name on some forms, my married name on others, because I was still sorting out which name went where in the mess of post-death paperwork, and my father watched me fumble between identities, and he used it. Eli left behind something else I kept, his appointment book. Leather-bound, the color of dark honey, with his initials embossed on the cover. E.A.M., Eli Adam Mathis. He wasn't a Mathis by birth. He took my name when we married because he said his family had given him nothing worth carrying, and mine had given him everything. I remember how my father beamed at the rehearsal dinner when Eli announced that. I remember my father shaking Eli's hand with both of his own and saying, "Welcome to the family, son." That appointment book sat on my bookshelf for 3 years. I'd touch the spine sometimes when I walked past. I never opened it. It smelled like Eli's office, like leather and the sandalwood candle he burned between sessions, and opening it felt like opening a door I wasn't ready to walk through. I didn't know yet that the names inside that book would become the most important evidence I'd ever hold. For nearly 3 years, my life operated on the architecture my father built for me. I rebuilt my caseload. I found a rhythm with Nora, who grew from a toddler saying Dada at the door to a bright, stubborn 5-year-old who liked dinosaurs and hated socks. I paid my bills. I went to Sunday dinners at my parents' house in Lake Oswego, where my mother Phyllis served pot roast, and my father asked about my clients in that way he had, leaning forward, nodding, making you feel like the most important person in the room. My brother Marcus was there too, 7 years older than me, always talking about his real estate deals, always one big score away from something. My father watched Marcus the way some men watch horse races, with a hunger disguised as faith. I loved those Sundays. I need you to understand that. I sat at that table and I felt held. I felt like the worst thing had already happened to me and the people around that table would never let anything else get through. That belief was the foundation of everything, and my father had been drilling holes in it since the month after Eli's funeral. The first crack came on a Wednesday in March. I was at lunch with a colleague, Priya, who worked at a group practice across town. We did peer review together twice a year, comparing notes on clinical approaches, keeping each other sharp. Priya was scrolling through some insurance billing data she'd pulled for an audit at her own practice, and she stopped mid-sentence. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Then she turned her laptop toward me and pointed at a line item, my license number, my full name. A client I had never heard of. "Catherine, did you take over Eli's clients?" she asked. The room tilted, not dramatically, just a degree. Just enough that my water glass looked slightly wrong on the table. I said no. I said I'd never treated any of Eli's clients. I said there must be a database error. Priya nodded, but she had a look that therapists recognize in each other. The look that says, "I believe you believe that, but I'm noting the discrepancy." I drove home and told myself it was nothing. A clerical mistake, a crossed wire in some insurance company's system. I put Nora to bed and sat on the couch and opened my laptop and told myself I was just going to check. Just a quick look. The way you tell yourself you're just going to read one email before bed. I logged into the provider portal for my licensing board and pulled my active billing records. My hands were shaking before I opened the licensing board portal. The page loaded slowly, the way things do when your pulse is running ahead of the connection speed. And there it was. 74 active client billings under my credentials. 74 names I had never seen. 74 people I had never sat across from, never listened to, never treated. All billed to insurance companies as my patients. All generating revenue. All running through a practice that was supposed to have been closed 28 months ago. I closed the laptop. I opened it. I closed it again. I sat in the dark living room and I listened to Nora breathing through the baby monitor, and I felt something I can only describe as the sensation of falling while sitting perfectly still. My license, my credentials, my name. 74 phantom patients billed in my name for therapy services I never provided. This was not a clerical error. This was fraud. And the only person who had access to my license number, my billing credentials, and the infrastructure of Eli's former practice was the person who'd been managing all of it since the day Eli died, my father. But I didn't call him. I didn't confront him. I sat with it. This is something people don't understand about discovery, about the moment you find the first thread. You don't pull it immediately. Your body won't let you. Your body is processing the chemical reality of betrayal before your mind has accepted the premise, and what your body does is freeze. I sat on that couch for 2 hours. My jaw ached from clenching. My hands were cold. My stomach had sealed itself shut, and my mind was running in circles, constructing defenses for my father that I didn't even know I was building. Maybe someone hacked his system. Maybe the billing company made an error. Maybe he authorized a locum therapist and forgot to tell me. Maybe. I went to bed at 2 a.m. and I did not sleep. The next 4 weeks were an exercise in controlled demolition of my own denial. I started with the billing records. I pulled every claim filed under my license number for the past 28 months. I printed them. I bought a 3-ring binder and plastic sheet protectors and colored tabs, and I organized 74 patient files that did not exist. I cross-referenced the CPT codes, the clinical codes that describe the type of therapy session billed. They were codes I used in my own practice: 90-minute initial intakes, 50-minute individual sessions, family therapy sessions. The codes were correct. That's what made them so dangerous. Whoever set this up knew the billing system well enough to use the right codes, the right session lengths, the right diagnostic categories. A CPA who'd been doing therapy practice books for years would know exactly which codes to use. Then I opened Eli's appointment book. I'd avoided it for 3 years. I picked it up from the shelf and my fingers found the embossed initials and my throat closed. I opened it anyway. His handwriting, small and precise, filled every page. Client initials, session times, brief notes. JT, 3 p.m. Discussed grief, mother. SR, 10 a.m. EMDR session 4. Good progress. His handwriting, his life's work. The last entry was 2 days before he died. I turned to the list of clients in the back, where Eli kept a master roster. 41 names. I compared them to the 74 names on the fraudulent billings. Not one overlap. Not a single name. My father had not even bothered to use Eli's real clients. He had invented 74 phantom human beings, assigned them diagnoses, billed for their treatment, and done it all under my name and my dead husband's practice address. Eli's appointment book, the grief keepsake I'd been afraid to open, had just become my first piece of evidence. This discovery changed the nature of what I was looking at. If my father had been billing Eli's actual former clients, you could construct a theory, however thin, that he was confused, that he thought he was closing out legitimate claims. But 74 invented patients with invented diagnoses? That is not confusion. That is architecture. In month 3, I went looking for the billing address. The claims listed a practice address I didn't recognize. Not Eli's old office, which had been vacated 18 months ago. A P.O. box. I drove to the post office on Hawthorne Boulevard on a Tuesday afternoon. I told the clerk I needed to verify a box registered in my name. She looked it up. Box 2247, registered to Catherine Mathis. Maiden name. My maiden name. The one I used on half my forms during the fog of early widowhood. The authorization on file was a letter bearing my signature, notarized. I asked for a copy. The clerk handed it across the counter, and I stood in the fluorescent light of that post office, and I read a letter I did not write, authorizing the opening of a P.O. box for professional correspondence, signed with a version of my signature that was close but not mine, the way my father might remember it from watching me sign birthday cards and Christmas checks over the years. And at the bottom of that letter, a notary stamp, a notary seal belonging to Phyllis Mathis, my mother. I walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat. I placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, and I pressed my forehead against the space between them, and I breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way I taught my clients. 4 counts in, 7 counts hold, 8 counts out. I did this for 6 minutes. I know because the parking meter was ticking, and I watched the minutes count down while I tried to hold together the 2 realities that were fighting for space in my mind. In one reality, my mother was the woman who brought me soup when Eli died, who held Nora while I cried, who told me I was the strongest person she knew. In the other reality, my mother had notarized a forged document that weaponized my professional license for profit. Both realities could not be true, but the notary stamp was not a feeling, it was a fact. And facts, as I tell my clients, do not require your permission to exist. Thanksgiving arrived, and with it the next layer of the dig. My parents' house in Lake Oswego, the same dining room, the same pot roast, the same illusion of warmth. Marcus was there with his wife. Nora was running between the kitchen and the living room with a paper turkey she'd made at preschool. I was performing. I was smiling at a table where every person except my daughter had either stolen from me, facilitated stealing from me, or benefited from stealing from me. The pot roast tasted like nothing. My jaw was sore from smiling. Marcus was talking about a property he'd picked up in the Pearl District, a renovation project. Big potential. He was animated, the way Marcus gets when he's spending money, and he said it without thinking. The way the truth sometimes escapes when the liar forgets to stand guard. Dad's investment really got the ball rolling on the Pearl place, he said, reaching for the cranberry sauce. I set my fork down. What investment? The color left Marcus's face the way water leaves a cracked glass, all at once, from everywhere. He looked at my father. My father's expression didn't change, but his hand moved. A small motion, almost invisible, a gesture that said, "Stop." Marcus mumbled something about a small loan, nothing major, changed the subject to football. My mother asked if anyone wanted more gravy. Nora showed me her paper turkey, and I sat there in my childhood dining room, and I understood that the $412,000 billed to phantom patients under my license had not vanished into some anonymous account. It had gone to Marcus. My father had stolen from me to fund my brother's real estate ambitions. If someone in your family ever called stealing from you an investment, you already know what I felt in that chair. Tell me in the comments, because I promise you are not the only one. In 3 months, I'd understand why Marcus couldn't look at me. That Thursday, I just thought he was tired. The following week, I called an attorney. Not a family attorney, a healthcare fraud attorney. Her name was Sandra Okafor, and she practiced out of a small firm in the Pearl District, which I found bitterly poetic given what Marcus was building there with my stolen money. Sandra was precise and unhurried in the way that expensive professionals are when they know the clock is running and the case is strong. I told her everything. She listened for 45 minutes without interrupting. Then she set her pen down and said, "Catherine, this is criminal." She didn't mean ethically wrong. She meant criminal. Felony insurance fraud, forgery, identity theft, misuse of a professional license. Sandra outlined what we needed. Bank routing records showing the flow of money from the fraudulent billings to my father and brother. I authorized her to subpoena them. The records came back in 3 weeks. Direct deposits from the billing account to a joint account held by Jean Mathis and Marcus Mathis. The account had been opened the month after Eli's funeral. The deposits were regular, bi-weekly, like a paycheck. My father had turned my grief into his son's salary. I sat in Sandra's office and looked at the routing numbers and the dollar amounts and the dates. I matched them to my calendar. A deposit on the day I'd taken Nora to the zoo with my parents. A deposit on the day my father brought me flowers for my birthday. A deposit the week I'd called him crying because I couldn't afford to fix the furnace and he'd said, "I wish I could help Katie Bird, but things are tight for us too." Things were tight, while $1,200 a week flowed from my license into Marcus's account. It was during this period that Diane reached out. Diane Park, Eli's former office manager. We had a complicated history, Diane and I. When Eli was alive, I'd resented her. She was efficient and organized in a way that made me feel like my own administrative chaos was a character flaw, and she had a familiarity with Eli's professional life that made me irrationally jealous. After Eli died, Diane had sent a card and I'd sent a thank you note, and we hadn't spoken since. So when her name appeared on my phone on a Tuesday evening, I didn't know what to feel. "Catherine, I need to talk to you about your father's billing," she said. No preamble. No, how are you? Diane was never one for preamble. She told me she'd heard through a former colleague about the billing anomaly. She told me she wasn't surprised. She told me that 18 months ago, while she was still wrapping up the last administrative details of Eli's practice closure, she'd flagged irregular invoices to my father. New client names appearing on billing documents for a practice that was supposed to be closed. She'd emailed him directly. His response came back in 1 minute. One word. Noted. She'd sent a follow-up asking for clarification. He responded again, this time longer, telling her the billings were authorized transitional services and that Catherine had approved them. Diane didn't believe him. She emailed a third time, asking for my direct confirmation. My father responded within the hour, telling Diane her contract was terminated effective immediately and to send her final invoice to his attention. "I kept every email," Diane said. "The sent messages, the read receipts, the timestamps. I kept them because something felt wrong and I wanted a record." Diane's email had a read receipt. Jean opened it at 9:47 a.m. and responded at 9:48 with one word. Noted. 60 seconds. Not even enough time to read the flagged irregularities she'd outlined. Just long enough to dismiss them. I'd spent years resenting this woman, and she was the one who'd tried to protect me when no one else bothered to notice. I sat on my kitchen floor after that phone call, with the same baby monitor crackling beside me that had been there the night I found the 74 names, and I cried. Not for my father. For the time I'd wasted distrusting someone who was trying to tell me the truth. But my initial reaction to Diane's call was not pure relief. Part of me, the part that had learned in the last 3 months that everyone I trusted could be operating from a hidden script, that part wondered if this was a test. Had my father sent Diane? Was he suspicious? Was this a trap designed to see if I was investigating? I called Sandra. Sandra said to meet with Diane in person in Sandra's office, on the record. If Diane was genuine, the meeting would produce evidence. If Diane was a plant, Sandra would identify the inconsistencies. Diane came to Sandra's office on a Friday afternoon. She brought a laptop and a printed stack of emails 3/4 of an inch thick. Sandra reviewed them for 90 minutes, every timestamp checked, every email header verified, every read receipt intact. Diane was not a plant. Diane was a witness, and her email chain was the digital trace that proved my father had been warned, had been given the chance to stop, and had chosen instead to silence the messenger and continue the fraud. After that meeting, Diane and I sat in Sandra's parking lot in my car, and she told me something about Eli that I carry with me. She said that in the last year of his life, Eli had been worried about my father's interest in the practice's finances. He'd told Diane to keep a separate copy of the books. "He didn't say why," Diane said. "He just said, 'Humor me, Diane. Keep a backup.'" Eli had sensed something I'd been too close to see. He'd planted a seed of protection that bloomed 3 years after his death, in the passenger seat of my car, in a parking lot in the Pearl District. What followed was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. Harder than finding Eli on the kitchen floor, harder than explaining to Nora that Daddy was in the sky now. For the next 3 months, I had to look my father in the face and pretend I didn't know. I had to sit at his table. I had to let him hold my daughter. I had to answer his phone calls and laugh at his jokes and accept his advice and carry the full weight of what he'd done to me while wearing the face of the daughter he thought was too trusting to look. This is the phase no one prepares you for. The investigation has a momentum that sustains you. You're doing something. You're building. You're moving toward an endpoint. But the masquerade, the daily performance of ignorance, that eats you from the inside out. I lost 11 pounds in those 3 months. My therapist, yes, therapists have therapists, noticed I was grinding my teeth in my sleep. I bought a mouth guard at CVS and wore it every night, and in the morning my jaw still ached from the effort of holding everything in. There were specific moments that almost broke me. A Sunday dinner in January where my father told a story about Eli, about how Eli had once called him at midnight because a client was in crisis, and Eli didn't know what to do, and my father had talked him through it. That's the kind of man Eli was, my father said, his eyes glistening. He cared about every single one of those clients. I looked at my plate, pot roast, mashed potatoes, gravy pooling like a small brown lake. My father was using my dead husband's compassion as a character reference for himself, while $412,000 of fraudulent billing sat in a binder in my closet. I said, "That's a beautiful story, Dad." My voice didn't crack. I counted that as a victory. Another moment. February. Gene called on a Wednesday evening and asked if he could come by that weekend to see Nora. I said of course. I hung up and realized my laptop was open on the kitchen table with Sandra's latest memo visible on screen, a memo titled Mathis Fraud Timeline, Exhibits A through F. I closed the laptop and moved it to my bedroom closet, on the shelf next to Eli's appointment book, and I stood there for a moment looking at the two objects side by side, the leather book that held my husband's real clients and the computer that held the evidence of my father's phantom ones. And I felt the distance between the man Eli was and the man my father turned out to be like a physical gap in my chest, a space where something used to be and wasn't anymore. Gene came that Saturday. He played with Nora in the living room while I made coffee in the kitchen. I could hear him doing the voice, the silly grandpa voice that made Nora shriek with laughter. My hands were steady as I poured the coffee. My breathing was regulated. Smile with the mouth, not the eyes, and don't let him get close enough to see the difference. He stayed for 2 hours. When he left, he hugged me at the door. His hands smelled like the same cologne Eli used to wear, something woody and warm, something I'd buried my face in 1,000 times, my father wearing my dead husband's scent. I almost broke. The door closed behind him, and I pressed my back against it and slid to the floor and pressed my fist against my mouth so Nora wouldn't hear. The ally function Diane served during this period was not just emotional, it was tactical. Twice I wanted to confront him. Twice Diane talked me down. The first time was after the Sunday dinner story about Eli. I called her from my car in the driveway of my parents' house and said, "I can't do this anymore. I'm going back in." Diane said 4 words. "You're not ready yet." She was right. We still needed the bank routing records from the second account, the one Sandra suspected existed for the overflow. The second time was after the cologne hug. I texted Diane at 11 p.m. "I want to send him everything." Diane called me back within 2 minutes. "Not yet," she said. 2 more weeks. We get the notarized documents authenticated, and then you never have to perform again. 2 weeks. 14 more dinners to cook while the binder in my closet grew. 14 more bedtimes where I read to Nora and then sat in the dark and reviewed evidence until my eyes burned. 14 more mornings where I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who was lying to everyone in her life except her 5-year-old daughter and a woman she used to resent. Then Jean sent the flowers. 2 weeks before the hearing date, a bouquet of white lilies, Eli's funeral flowers, with a handwritten card. Katie Bird, I know these years have been hard. I'm so proud of who you've become. Love always, Dad. I held that card and I looked at the lilies, and for one terrible, destabilizing moment, I believed him. I believed the card. I believed the man who signed it. I believed in the father who taught me to ride a bike in the Lake Oswego driveway, his hand steady on the seat, his voice saying, "You've got it. You've got it. I'm right here." I believed in that man for about 90 seconds. Then I walked to my closet and I opened the evidence binder to the page where I'd printed the voicemail transcripts. I read the one Jean had left Marcus 3 days after my birthday. She's still signing her maiden name on half her forms. She'll never catch it, and if she does, she owes me too much to talk. I read it twice. I put the card in the recycling. I put the flowers on the porch. My resolve was not shaken again. The case file was complete. Let me tell you what it contained, because the evidence is not a sidebar in this story. It is the story. 74 annotated fraudulent claims, each one cross-referenced against Eli's appointment book to demonstrate that not a single phantom patient corresponded to a real human being. The forged P.O. Box authorization bearing my mother's notary stamp. Bank routing records showing direct deposits into the Jean Marcus joint account. Diane's complete email chain with timestamps and read receipts. The second voicemail transcript. A letter from Sandra outlining the legal framework for criminal referral. And my own professional analysis, because this is where my training became my weapon. As a licensed marriage and family therapist, I know exactly how the licensing board investigative process works. I know which filings trigger mandatory review. I know which evidence formats are admissible. I know the clinical codes, the CPT codes, better than any attorney because I use them every day. I annotated every fraudulent claim with the specific codes that proved I never saw those clients, never conducted those sessions, never performed those assessments. The intake codes reference diagnostic instruments I've never been trained to administer. The family therapy codes listed household configurations that were internally inconsistent. The session notes, the ones Jean had fabricated to support the billings, used therapeutic terminology incorrectly in ways that only a clinician would catch. My father knew enough to fool an insurance company. He did not know enough to fool me. I filed the board complaint 5 months before the hearing. I want you to understand that timeline. 5 months. The investigation by the board was already underway while I was still sitting at Sunday dinners and smiling at pot roast. The board's investigators had already subpoenaed Jean's records, already verified the fraudulent billings, already traced the money. By the time the formal review hearing was scheduled, the investigation was complete. The hearing was not the beginning of the process. It was the end. My father just didn't know it. The hearing was set for a Tuesday in October. 90 days out. That countdown ran like a second heartbeat beneath every conversation, every Sunday dinner, every phone call. I prepared the way I prepare for everything in my professional life, methodically, thoroughly, and with the understanding that the person across from me will try to control the narrative, and my job is to let the facts speak for themselves. Jean's attorney contacted Sandra 2 weeks before the hearing. He wanted to discuss the possibility of Catherine providing a statement that she had authorized the billings. This was my father's play. He expected me to cover for him. He believed, and this is the part that still makes me catch my breath, he genuinely believed I would sit in a formal hearing and lie to protect the man who had stolen my name and my livelihood and my dead husband's legacy. Because I always had. Because I was his Katie Bird. Because she'll sign whatever I put in front of her. She always has. Sandra declined the request without explanation. Jean's attorney asked again. Sandra declined again. I imagine my father's confusion in those 2 weeks, the dawning sense that the daughter who always cooperated was not cooperating, the first fissure in the assumption that had funded his entire scheme, that I loved him too much to fight him. The morning of the hearing, I dropped Nora at school. She was wearing a yellow raincoat with frog buttons because it was Portland, and it was October, and it was always raining. She hugged me at the school gate and said, "Have a good day, Mama." I held that hug for 3 extra seconds. Then I drove to Salem. The hearing room was on the 4th floor of a state building that smelled like industrial carpet and recycled air. Fluorescent lighting, long tables, microphones, institutional. The kind of room where fates are determined by people in business casual. There were chairs for the board members, 7 of them, arranged in a curved row behind a long table. There were chairs for the respondents and their counsel. There were chairs for witnesses. And there were chairs for the gallery, the observers, the professional community members who showed up to these proceedings the way some people show up to town councils, because the machinery of accountability is only as strong as the people willing to watch it operate. I arrived first. I chose a seat at the respondents' table and I arranged my materials. The binder, Eli's appointment book, leather warm under my hands, my laptop, open to Diane's email archive, a printed copy of the voicemail transcripts, the paper slightly soft from how many times I'd read and reread them. Sandra sat beside me. She was wearing a navy suit and she smelled like coffee, and she said nothing because there was nothing to say. The hearing room was still filling. A woman in the gallery coughed and the sound bounced off the low ceiling tiles and came back flat. The clock on the wall behind the board's table was analog, white face, black hands, the kind they put in rooms where time matters and no one wants to argue about whether it's accurate. I watched the second hand sweep past the 9, past the 10. The room smelled like floor wax and the particular staleness of a building whose windows don't open. Gene arrived at 9:12, 18 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin. He was wearing the charcoal suit he wore to Eli's funeral. I noticed that immediately, and the recognition hit me in the sternum. The same suit. The same white shirt beneath it. Even the same tie, silver gray with a thin diagonal stripe. The tie my mother had picked out for him that morning 3 years ago because he'd stood in his closet and said he didn't know what you wear to bury your son-in-law. He was with his attorney, a man named Douglas Wren, who looked like he'd been briefed on one version of this story and was about to hear another. My father saw me and his face did something complicated. Relief and confusion and something that might have been hope. He walked toward me. He started to speak. "Katie Bird, I'm glad you're—" "Please sit down, Mr. Mathis." Sandra's voice. Flat. Professional. A door closing. My father sat. He adjusted the knot of his tie, that silver gray tie, and the gesture was so familiar it could have been any Sunday, any holiday, any moment in the architecture of normal life. He looked at me across the space between our tables, and I saw him trying to read my face the way he'd always read it, looking for the daughter who would follow his lead. I gave him nothing. I had practiced giving him nothing for 3 months. My face was a wall he helped me build. The hearing began at 9:30. The board chair, a woman named Dr. Anissa Williams, opened with procedural language, the specific complaint, the license number in question, the scope of the investigation. Her voice was measured and unhurried. She read the case number aloud, and the numbers hung in the air like coordinates to a place none of us wanted to be. My father's attorney had prepared a statement. He began to read it. The statement characterized the billing irregularities as administrative errors during a period of transition following the unexpected death of the practice's primary clinician. It used the word misunderstanding 4 times. It suggested that Catherine Mathis, in her grief, had authorized broad administrative discretion and that Mr. Gene Mathis had operated within that authorization in good faith. I listened to every word. I had anticipated every word. Sandra had predicted this defense 6 weeks ago, and I had built my rebuttal around it the way you build a structure around a load-bearing wall, knowing exactly where the weight would fall. When Douglas Wren finished, the board chair asked if I wished to respond. I said yes. I stood because I wanted to be standing. I wanted my father to have to look up at me. The chair scraped against the floor when I pushed it back, a sharp sound in the quiet room, and 2 people in the gallery shifted in their seats. "I'd like to begin with Exhibit 1, I said. My voice was steady. My hands were steady. Everything I'd been holding for 7 months had distilled into a clarity that felt almost chemical, not calm exactly, but beyond the reach of panic. Exhibit 1 is the first of 74 fraudulent insurance claims filed under my license number. This claim is for a 90-minute initial intake session with a patient I will refer to as Patient 1. The session is dated March 15th of last year. The CPT code used is 90837. The diagnosis code is F43.10, post-traumatic stress disorder. The billing address is P.O. Box 2247 on Hawthorne Boulevard." I looked at my father. He was watching me with an expression I'd seen on the faces of clients when reality arrives faster than their defenses can process it. The expression that says, "This is not what I prepared for." His hands were flat on the table in front of him, fingers slightly spread, the way a person braces when they feel the floor tilt. Douglas Wren had stopped writing on his legal pad. His pen hovered above the yellow paper, motionless. "I did not conduct this session," I continued. "I have never met Patient 1. I have never treated anyone at that billing address. I have never authorized the use of my license number for services I did not provide. Exhibit 1A is a page from the appointment book of my late husband, Eli Mathis, showing his complete client roster. Patient 1 does not appear. Exhibit 1B is a printout from my own scheduling system showing my client appointments for March 15th of last year. I was in session with my own clients from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. The alleged 90-minute intake with Patient 1 was billed for 10 a.m., during which time I was conducting a session with an actual human being in my actual office. Douglas Wren raised his hand. "We request a brief recess." The board chair looked at her colleagues. One of them, a man with reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead, shook his head almost imperceptibly. "We'll continue with the presentation, Mr. Wren." I presented the next claim. And the next. I didn't present all 74 individually. That would have taken hours. But I presented 12 in full detail, each one chosen because it demonstrated a different facet of the fraud. One was billed on a day I was homesick with the flu, a day my father knew I was homesick because he had called to check on me, and I'd answered the phone with a voice so hoarse he'd told me to drink hot water with lemon. One used a family therapy code for a household configuration that listed 3 adults and a minor. Impossible for an individual therapist to serve simultaneously. One used a diagnostic code for a condition that requires specialized training I have never received, training that would be reflected in my licensing file, which the board had already verified contained no such credential. One was billed for a telehealth session, but the IP metadata Sandra had obtained showed the session was logged from a computer at my father's home address, not from any device I have ever owned. The IP address resolved to a residential internet account registered to Jean and Phyllis Mathis at the Lake Oswego address, where I had eaten pot roast and smiled and counted the days until this hearing. With each exhibit, I watched my father's attorney lean closer to my father and whisper. I watched my father shake his head. I watched the cycle begin. Deny. Whisper. Shake. Deny. The gallery was silent except for the occasional creak of a chair. Someone in the second row was taking notes. The scratch of pen on paper rhythmic and relentless, like a second clock marking time that could not be taken back. After the 12th claim, Douglas Wren requested a second recess. The board granted 5 minutes. During those 5 minutes, I heard my father's voice from across the room, not shouting but intense, the voice he used when Marcus came home with a bad report card, the voice that ran hot beneath a controlled surface, saying, "She authorized it. She signed the forms. I have her signatures." Sandra leaned toward me. "He's going to argue you consented." "I know," I said. "That's why we have the next exhibit." The hearing resumed. Douglas Wren stood and stated that his client possessed documentation bearing Catherine Mathies's signature authorizing broad administrative management of the practice, including billing. He held up a manila folder. His hands were steady, but his voice had the careful quality of someone walking across ice. I said, "Exhibit 14 is the P.O. Box authorization letter filed with the United States Postal Service for Box 2247, Hawthorne Boulevard. The signature on this letter purports to be mine. I'd like the board to compare it to my verified signature on file with the licensing board." I placed both documents side by side on the table. The board members leaned forward. Dr. Williams adjusted her glasses. The room was so quiet I could hear the fluorescent tube above us, cycling through its faint electrical hum. The differences were subtle, but undeniable. My actual signature has a specific break between the C and the rest of Catherine, a habit I've had since I was 18. The forged signature is continuous. My actual signature tilts 2 degrees to the left. The forged signature is upright. When I pointed to the break, the gap between the C and the A that has been part of my handwriting since I signed my first lease, I heard someone in the gallery inhale. "Additionally," I said, "the notary stamp on this authorization belongs to Phyllis Mathis, my mother. The notary certification states that the signer appeared in person and was verified to be Catherine Mathis. My mother would not need to verify my identity. She raised me, and I was not present when this document was signed because it was not signed by me." The room was very quiet. I could hear the ventilation system pushing air through a duct somewhere above the ceiling tiles. I could hear Douglas Wren's pen click, once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession before he set it down on the table, as if it had become something he didn't want to hold. My father stood up. His attorney put a hand on his arm. My father shook it off. The chair behind him rolled backward and struck the low partition separating the respondent's area from the gallery, and the sound was small and sharp, like a period at the end of a sentence. "Katie, I did this for the family," he said. His voice broke on the word family. "Marcus needed a start. Eli's practice was just sitting there. That money was going to waste. I was trying to help everyone. That's all I've ever done." The board chair asked him to sit down. He didn't. He was gripping the edge of his table with both hands, and I could see the tendons standing out on the backs of them, the hands that had held a bicycle seat steady on a Lake Oswego driveway, the hands that had signed checks from an account funded by 74 people who never existed. "You don't understand," he said, and he was looking at me, only at me, with an expression I recognized from every therapy session I'd ever conducted where a client breaks, where the mask dissolves and the real face surfaces, and the real face is always more afraid than the mask was angry. "I did this because I love you. Everything I do is for you and Marcus and your mother. This family is everything to me." I heard the words. I let them land. I let them sit in the air between us long enough that everyone in the room could hear the shape of them, the practiced cadence, the same cadence I'd heard on the birthday voicemail. I had rehearsed this moment in the bathroom mirror for 11 days, not the words, the stillness, the refusal to react on his timeline. I nodded. Then I said, "Exhibit 15. I pressed play on my phone. The speakers on the table carried the sound to every corner of the room. My father's voice filled the space, warm and slightly nasal, the voice that had narrated my bedtime stories and talked me through my first heartbreak and told me I was going to be a wonderful therapist. Everything I do is for you, sweetheart. Happy birthday, Katie Bird. I love you. The voicemail ended. 3 seconds of silence. I watched my father's face as he heard himself. His mouth opened slightly, like a man preparing to catch something falling. I pressed play on the second recording. My father's voice again. Same timbre, same cadence. 3 days later. The same vocal cords. The same breath patterns. The same man. She's still signing her maiden name on half her forms. She'll never catch it. And if she does, she owes me too much to talk. The room went silent. Not the silence of absence, the silence of 40 people simultaneously revising their understanding of the man standing in front of them. I watched the silence land on my father the way weather lands on a landscape, changing everything without moving anything. His face lost its animation. The plea in his eyes went out like a light switched off from inside. I watched him hear his own voice saying the thing he believed about me, the real thing, not the birthday message, but the assessment, the calculation. She'll never catch it. And if she does, she owes me too much to talk. A woman in the gallery pressed her hand against her mouth. The board member with the reading glasses on his forehead slowly removed them and set them on the table as though he no longer needed to see the documents to understand what was in front of him. I let 20 seconds pass. I counted them. I let the room hold the weight of those 2 voicemails, the 2 versions of my father existing simultaneously in the same institutional air, the same fluorescent light falling on both. I did not owe him. I did not owe the man who forged my name and stole my dead husband's legacy and turned my grief into a business opportunity. I did not owe him my silence. I did not owe him my complicity. I did not owe him the performance of a daughter too grateful and too broken to look at the numbers. Exhibit 16, I said. Bank routing records showing direct deposits from the fraudulent billing account to a joint account held by Jean Mathis and Marcus Mathis, opened the month following Eli's death. Total deposits over 33 months, $412,000. The first deposit was made 19 days after my husband's funeral. The most recent deposit was made 6 days before the flowers arrived at my door. Douglas Wren requested a third recess. The board chair denied it. Douglas Wren looked at my father. My father was staring at the table in front of him, at his own hands, as though he were trying to reconcile the instruments of the fraud with the instruments of the fatherhood, and finding that they were the same 10 fingers. I presented Diane's email chain. Every email, every timestamp, every read receipt. Jean's one-word response. Noted. The termination of Diane's contract within hours of her raising the alarm. The pattern of a man who, when confronted with evidence of his own fraud, did not pause or reconsider or self-correct, but instead eliminated the source of the evidence and continued. I placed Diane's printout on the table and I read the termination email aloud. Diane, your services are no longer required. Please submit your final invoice to my attention. Jean Mathis. 14 words to dismiss the one person who had tried to stop him. 14 words that took less time to write than the voicemail took to record. Then I sat down. My hands found the surface of the table again, the same cool laminate, and I pressed my palms flat and I breathed. Sandra presented the legal summary. The board members asked questions. My father's attorney attempted to negotiate, his voice carrying the careful exhaustion of a man who understood that the negotiation had ended 40 minutes ago, and what remained was procedure. The board chair stated that the matter would be referred for criminal investigation and that the licensing actions would proceed on the documented evidence. My father looked at me one more time before his attorney walked him out of the room. The look was not anger. It was not shame. It was bewilderment. The genuine bewilderment of a man who cannot understand why the system he built has stopped working. He'd built a system where his daughter's grief made her pliable, where her trust made her blind, where her love made her silent. And the system had worked for nearly 3 years. He could not process its failure. He could not see that the failure was not the system breaking down, but the system being seen. He reached for the door handle and paused. half turned, as if he expected me to say something, to call him back, to give him the ending he'd written in his mind, where Katie Bird forgives, and the family reconvenes, and the table is set for Sunday dinner. I said nothing. The door opened. The door closed. The sound it made was small and mechanical, a latch engaging, a lock finding its place. I sat in that institutional chair and I pressed my palms flat against the table and I felt the surface, cool and smooth and solid, and I held on to it because solid surfaces were all I could trust. Sandra put her hand on my shoulder, once, briefly, and then began packing her files. The gallery emptied slowly. Chairs scraped. Footsteps receded down the hallway. The analog clock on the wall read 10:47. The entire hearing had lasted 77 minutes. 77 minutes to dismantle what had taken my father 33 months to build. The dominoes fell without my pushing them. That is the thing about filing accurately with institutions that have enforcement power. You don't have to orchestrate the consequences. You provide the truth, and the machinery operates. Jean's CPA license was revoked by reciprocal action within 60 days. The State Board of Accountancy received the licensing board's findings and initiated its own review, which concluded before Jean's attorney had finished drafting his appeal. The revocation notice was mailed to the Lake Oswego address on a Monday. I know because my aunt told me my mother collected the mail that day and stood in the driveway reading the letter and then went inside and did not come out for 3 days. Marcus's real estate license triggered an ethics review when the board's published findings named the joint account. The review wasn't about Marcus directly. It was about the source of funds used to obtain his properties. When you build a house on stolen money, the foundation is evidence. The Pearl District renovation he'd been so proud of at Thanksgiving, the property that Dad's investment had gotten rolling, was flagged for a title audit. 3 of his 4 properties entered review. The phone calls from his partners stopped being returned. Phyllis's notary commission was referred for fraud investigation. The woman who notarized the document that started everything now faced the bureaucratic machinery she had quietly served for 20 years, except now the machinery was facing her. I did not gloat. I want to be clear about that. I did not celebrate. I went home and I picked up Nora from school and I made her macaroni and cheese for dinner and I sat on the couch and I watched her draw dinosaurs on construction paper with a green crayon worn down to a nub, her tongue poking out the side of her mouth the way Eli's used to when he was concentrating, and I felt the specific exhaustion of a person who has been clenching every muscle for 7 months and has finally been told they can stop. My jaw unclenched. My shoulders dropped an inch. The house was quiet except for the sound of crayon on paper and the refrigerator humming its low, steady note in the kitchen. Jean tried to get ahead of the truth. In the weeks after the hearing, I learned from Sandra that he had called family friends, former colleagues, people from church, telling his version. An overenthusiastic favor, administrative errors, his ungrateful daughter. He called me vindictive in a conversation with my aunt that my aunt later reported to me verbatim, not out of loyalty to me, but out of horror at his description. But the board's findings were public record. The documented evidence was available, and every person Jean called eventually encountered the same problem. His story contradicted itself. He told one person he'd had my authorization. He told another he'd been trying to protect me from the burden. He told a third that the money was always meant to come back to me. 3 stories, 3 audiences. The same man who couldn't keep his version straight with investigators couldn't keep it straight with his social circle. His credibility collapsed, not because I accused him loudly, but because he contradicted himself repeatedly. The truth has one version. Lies require memory. And my father's memory was buckling under the weight of what he'd built. Marcus called me once, 3 weeks after the hearing. He was angry, which I expected. He said I'd destroyed the family, which I expected. He said Dad was just trying to help, which I expected. Then his voice broke, and he said, "I didn't know where the money came from, Kath. I swear I didn't know." And I wanted to believe him. The way I'd wanted to believe the birthday voicemail. The way I'd wanted to believe the flowers. But Marcus had sat at that Thanksgiving table and said, "Dad's investment," with the casual certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was holding and had decided not to ask how it was obtained. Choosing not to know is its own kind of knowing. I told Marcus I loved him. I told him I couldn't talk to him right now. I haven't spoken to him since. Phyllis never called. My mother, who held me after Eli died, who watched Nora while I rebuilt my practice, who witnessed a forged document with full knowledge of what it was, never called. Her silence told me everything her notary stamp already had. She had chosen her husband over her daughter, and she did not intend to apologize for the choice. I waited 30 days. Then I stopped waiting. There is a difference between patience and suspension, and I had spent 3 years suspended in a version of family that was never real. 30 days was enough. I took Eli's appointment book off the shelf for the last time on a Sunday evening in December. The house was quiet. Nora was asleep. Rain was tapping against the window in the irregular rhythm that Portland rain has in winter. Not steady but conversational, like the sky is working something out. I'd opened the book so many times during the investigation that the spine was soft now, the pages falling open to the client roster at the back. I ran my thumb across Eli's handwriting, the small, precise letters, the abbreviations only he understood, the notes that showed a man who paid attention to every person who sat across from him. I thought about what Diane had told me in the parking lot, that Eli had asked her to keep a backup of the books. He'd sensed something. He couldn't have known what, but he'd felt the vibration of something wrong in the foundation, and his instinct had been to protect. Even after death, Eli was still protecting. His appointment book had proven the fraud. His office manager had preserved the evidence. His practice, the thing he built with care and precision and genuine love for the work, had been weaponized and then, through its own records, had fought back. I closed the book. I held it for a moment against my chest, the leather warm from my hands, the embossed initials pressing against my collarbone. EAM. I placed it in a box with Eli's other things, the coffee mug with the chip on the rim, his favorite sweater, the constellation map he'd annotated with the dates he'd first shown each one to Nora. The box went to the top shelf of my closet, not discarded, not displayed, held. The way you hold something that belongs to a person you loved, who is gone, but whose presence still shapes the architecture of your days. Months passed. The legal proceedings continued without requiring my active participation. Sandra handled the criminal referral. The board's enforcement actions proceeded on their own timeline. I went back to my practice. I saw my clients. I picked up Nora from school. I cooked dinner. I slept without the mouthguard for the first time in March, and I noticed because I'd been wearing it so long that my teeth felt strange without it. Exposed. The way you feel strange without armor after you've worn it long enough. On the first night without it, I lay in bed and ran my tongue along my teeth and felt the absence of the guard like the absence of a weight I had mistaken for part of my body. Diane and I developed something I can only call a friendship forged in investigation. We had lunch every other week at a Thai place on Division Street that Eli used to love. The restaurant had a wooden booth in the back corner where the light came through a window covered in condensation, and we always sat there because Diane said Eli used to sit there, and she liked the continuity. We didn't always talk about the case. Sometimes we talked about Nora, or Diane's volunteer work, or the Trailblazers. But there was always a moment, usually near the end of the meal, when one of us would say something that only made sense to someone who'd been inside the same search for truth. A shorthand, a shared vocabulary. The bond formed through the experience of uncovering what someone wanted to keep buried carries a weight that ordinary friendship doesn't. It's not heavier, it's denser, more concentrated. Diane understood what it cost to smile at Sunday dinner. No one else could. On a Saturday morning in April, I drove east on I-84 toward the gorge with Nora in the back seat, singing along to a song about a shark. The sky was the particular gray that Portland does better than anywhere else. The gray that isn't gloomy but soft, like the sky is thinking about something. I passed the exit for Lake Oswego without stopping. I felt the pull. The way the steering wheel wants to turn toward a place your body remembers even when your mind has resigned it. My parents' house was 6 minutes off that exit. The driveway where my father taught me to ride a bike, his hand steady on the seat, his voice behind me saying, "You've got it, Katie Bird. I'm right here. Don't look back. Just pedal." I drove past the exit. My hand stayed at 10 and 2. Nora was singing. The road ahead was clear, and the gray sky was gentle, and I let the tears come because they weren't the tears of someone broken. They were the tears of someone grieving a man who may never have existed. The father who held the bicycle seat. The father who called me his pride and joy. I will miss that man for the rest of my life. And I know, in the way you know things that your body understood before your mind caught up, that he may never have been real. He may have always been the man in the second voicemail, the one who looked at his grieving daughter and saw not a person to protect, but a signature to use. I will never know which version came first. I will never know if the father I loved was the mask or the face. And that, more than the money, more than the fraud, more than the hearing, that is the thing I cannot recover from, the not knowing. Research shows that up to 60% of family fraud cases involve an elder relative exploiting a younger family member's trust during a period of vulnerability. Separately, studies on licensing fraud indicate that approximately 70% of cases involve a perpetrator who had legitimate access to the victim's credentials before the abuse began. I am a data point in both statistics, but I am not a number. I am a woman who sat in a state building in Salem, Oregon, and pressed play on her father's voice, and let the room hear the difference between what he said to her face and what he said behind her back. I used to believe that trust and love were the same thing, that if you loved someone enough, trust was automatic, permanent, a condition of the relationship rather than a choice you make with your eyes open every day. I was wrong. Love and trust are different currencies. You can spend one without the other. You can love someone who has made themselves unworthy of trust, and you can trust people you're still learning to love. The difference between the two is the difference between the first voicemail and the second. Both spoken by the same man. Both true. Neither complete. If you are sitting somewhere right now holding a piece of evidence that changes everything you believed about someone you love, if you are smiling at a table where the food tastes like nothing because your body knows what your mind hasn't accepted, I want you to know something. The weight of knowing is terrible. The weight of not knowing was worse. You just couldn't feel it because it was distributed across every moment of every day, built into the architecture of a life designed to keep you comfortable and compliant. The moment you find the truth, the weight concentrates into a single unbearable point, but concentrated weight can be set down. Distributed weight, the kind you don't know you're carrying, that you carry forever. This story has been told. One leather appointment book that proved 74 patients never existed. One voicemail that said everything I do is for you, and another that said she'll never catch it. And one licensing board hearing where a daughter stopped being a signature and started being a witness. If you've ever had to choose between protecting someone you love and protecting yourself, or if you know what it feels like to realize that the person who was supposed to protect you was the one you needed protection from, I'd like to hear your story. Leave it in the comments. You are not alone, and the truth, however late it arrives, is always worth the cost of finding it. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing stories from people who chose the truth.